I went back to my classroom halfway through the year in February after my maternity leave was over. And I decided to jump right in and get started with inquiry right away. So tonight I'm going to be talking about what happened, including what went wrong, what worked well, what I didn't really think about beforehand, and what I wish I would have known 2 months ago. So we're going to dig right in. My name is Patty, and I am the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com. And this is Teaching with Inquiry Live. This is my weekly show where I talk to teachers about what inquiry looks like and share my experiences in my classroom, hopefully to help you fit all together so you can use inquiry in your classroom to make teaching and learning with you and your students just a little bit more fun and maybe take some of the stress and pressure off. So like I said, I went back in February and I decided, throw caution at the wind, we were going to do inquiry. I mean, really, I could have just gone back and said, kind of played it till the end of the year and said, I can just go status quo and keep on trucking, go traditional route and not change very much and just make it to the end of the year and coast by. Unfortunately, that's not in my DNA, I don't think. And I'm never one that would take necessarily the easy road. I always like to make things maybe a bit more difficult than I need to. So I dug right into inquiry. And I did it with a group that I have never taught before, which is sometimes a little bit different for me because I normally loop with my students. So I have them for 4 and have them for 5. So I really was starting with a brand new crop of students. So there's a few things that didn't really work for me. So for one, the first thing that I learned was definitely communication. That was the first hurdle that I had to tackle for myself. One, it was me communicating with the students and establishing a sense of trust between me and them. In order for them to learn from me, there does need to be the element that they need to trust that when we go into a knowledge building circle and they're sharing their ideas, that I am a safe adult that they can share that information with, and I'm not going to be overly judgy or too critical, and it's not really going to be a high stakes conversation. So I really needed to be clear with my students. So there needed to be better communication between me and them. And I needed to establish some trust between us. I also needed to go over what my expectations were for how they communicated with one another. And this was probably the most frustrating thing that I had to deal with, was getting my students to learn to communicate in a way that might be a little bit different. So instead of it being, say, a sense of competitive communication where they're just fighting against one another to get the right answer or to be the person to say the right thing, I really needed them to not just listen to me, but listen to one another. And that meant that I had to establish those norms of communication. I needed to guide them through what that was going to look like. And I had to walk them through that. And sometimes it was a little bit harder than others, and recognize that and reflect for myself that this was September for me. This was building routines. They had already been there and I was the new person coming in. So I needed to reestablish things and I needed to slow it down a little bit and understand that I was asking them to do something that may come to them a little bit differently. So they had to get used to sitting in a circle. They had to get used to not talking over top of one another. It's not that they didn't know how to talk. They knew how to talk. They were a chatty group, but they needed to harness that and teach them kind of the norms of how to communicate. So we talked about how to build on ideas of others. We had to deal with some of the negative issues that were happening in the classroom, whether it was bullying or there was a lack of trust in between students. So I had to work on that and acknowledge that this was happening. So we not only had to deal with that in our class time, but we also had to have really time to spend just airing out all of our grievances and talking about our frustrations and sharing our feelings and thoughts about how our classroom was operating and what that was happening. So we really needed to kind of get kind of ugly about what we were talking about so that we could level that playing field for communication and really kind of take apart any of the drama. And I had to go way back in my toolkit and rely on things that I probably hadn't employed for over 10 years when I was a child and youth worker, to pull that stuff back out and really get to the bottom of some of the issues that may have been happening in my classroom. So that was definitely one thing that I had to undo and then redo in my classroom to get ready for inquiry so that we could share ideas with one another. One of the things that I didn't do, and you may have noticed the lack of photos of my room or of things I was doing, whether it be on my Instagram or whether it be here on Facebook, is I didn't do my bulletin boards and I didn't have anchor charts. And this was a big old fail on my part. I know that an important part of any teaching, whether you're doing traditional teaching, whether you're doing inquiry-based teaching, whatever kind of teaching you're doing, one high yield strategy is to make the learning visible. And I just didn't. Life got in the way, basketball got in the way, coaching and doing stuff during my nutrition breaks and after school, 3 kids, going to the gym, life got in the way. So I didn't necessarily have the time to put everything up on a bulletin board or write out all of our discussions on an anchor chart and make that classroom ready, because you can't if you listened last week, you'll know why I recreate all of my anchor charts. So I have anchor charts, but they were sitting buried in the flip chart stand in my room. So I have them, but I never got around to posting them. And I had all of the success criteria and all of the Wonderwall pictures and things that we had discussed as a group and sticky notes from students. I had them, I didn't put them up and I didn't display them. And sure, maybe not the best, but it is what it is. I didn't get them up, I didn't have the time. There was a lot that was coming at me, readjusting to getting 3 kids out of school or 3 kids ready for school in the morning and me at work on time, sickness, and all of those things that come together. It just didn't get done. Now I'm hoping that with my second unit coming up, that's something that I can work on. But I think my takeaway is it better if I had my anchor charts and if I had my Wonderwall up and all of the student stuff up there for students to see? Yeah, it would have been better. But can inquiry happen without it? Yep, it can happen without it. It may be a little bit more work on my part. It may be a bit more difficult in terms of making sure that we're always on the right page, because if we don't have something that students can reference without coming to me. But inquiry can still happen even if your bulletin boards and your anchor charts aren't the prettiest and they're not always up when they're supposed to be up. You can still do it. So I had to get over that one and let it go. It didn't work. So I'm going to try next time with my next unit to make sure that it does. Another thing that I had to adjust for was technology. Now, I am an avid tech user in my classroom, even though I only have 7 iPads in my classroom that are assigned to me, plus the devices that I allow for the bring your own devices. I do allow my students to bring in their own tech. I only have about 3 or 4 students doing that, so I still don't have anywhere close to a 1-to-1 and not even really a 2-to-1 ratio most days. I do have 7 iPads in my classroom, so learning how to use tech was a readjustment for me, because of course when you're off for 14 months, things change, apps update, tech updates, and new features come out. So things that I expected to be there weren't, and there were new things that I discovered along the way. It also meant my students who, because we only had 7, may not have been as familiar with using those pieces of technology in the classroom. We had to spend an extra long amount of time reviewing how to use tech as a tool. So most of my students are really comfortable using tech as a toy because they use it at home. These are digital natives we're talking about. They have an iPad. They were probably born with a device accessible to them. So they know what tech is, but how do they use that tech in order to facilitate learning? That was the challenge for them. So I had to beg and borrow some of my time from my language arts and from other areas of my day in order to support that. So we needed to look at what Google Classroom was, getting them logged in Google Classroom, getting them to know what their usernames and passwords were, getting them how to working with Google Drive and what that meant, what it looks like, how to save things, and the fact that you don't save things, that your teacher can track what you're doing, and that I can see when you said, oh, it just deleted on me, and I can go in and say, no, you didn't have anything done in the first place. All of those lovely features of the technology. We had to learn that as a class. We also had to learn, the big thing we needed to learn is copying off the internet is not a good idea. So we had to learn what plagiarism was and how to research appropriately. So this is where I'm forever thankful that I get to teach both language and science and social studies and math to my homeroom class, because I have a split. I have purposely not given away the ability to teach my class as a split during science and social studies, as well as keep them for language too, because I need that time in language to be able to reinforce and build some of the skills that I rely on in order to use inquiry most effectively during my science and social studies. We do touch on inquiry philosophy teaching in the other areas, but my main target of where I'm using the most level of inquiry is definitely in science and social studies. So I needed to use the time in math and in language to build on those necessary skills. And it took time. And one of the ways that we did that is you always are going to have students in your class that are going to be what I like to call early adopters. You show them once or twice, they get it, they can follow those instructions. Using those students as your peer tech leads, so that not every time a student doesn't know how to log into Google Classroom, they don't necessarily need to come directly to you. They can go to that other student, and that student can walk them through how to log in. And once you have one or two tech leads, you can then kind of grow in a viral sense. You can grow capacity amongst the rest of the students because you've got two or three, they show another group, they get better at it, and then you get more and more and more. So you can rely on those skills. Another thing, I think the biggest thing that most teachers worry about when it comes to inquiry is assessment. Now, for me, this was either hit or miss. I'm constantly assessing in my mind. I am always tracking the conversations I'm having with students, and I'm trying to decide, okay, who's getting it, who's not getting it, who do I need to spend more time with tomorrow? And I'm doing that kind of on the fly, and it's just something that I've always really taken for granted, that I can assess what's happening and then pivot and change for the next day what I'm going to do based on what I saw today. And that's always been something that I've done pretty well at. One of the areas that I do need to improve upon, and it was only highlighted in this last unit for me, is I need to be better at actually tracking those observations with students. I need to write them down, or I need to be capturing that happening more often. I definitely take pictures of what is happening in the learning that's happening in my classroom. And I do take mental notes, but I need to physically write those down so that I can better kind of attend to who is doing what, so that if somebody does want to see kind of what my observations were and they're on paper, then I have them. Now, one of the ways that I'm quickly discovering is really handy is using the app Edocio. When I first came back into the classroom, my brain just wasn't ready to kind of be there. I wasn't ready to be using apps to do assessment, and I just simply had a notebook where I just hand wrote kind of observations and reflections at the end of the day. But that doesn't last forever, especially for me. It just doesn't last. So I needed a better way to be able to quickly track my observations, either a yes, a no, or a maybe. Even if it's a class list where I'm just kind of going, yes, no, maybe, yes, they get it, no, they don't get it, or they might get it, go back and check. So I have finally gotten myself ready that I can go back and use Edocio. I don't actually use it for planning. I know they have that functionality, but I am using it for my markbook. And one of the reasons which I'm finding actually Adosio is really handy, even over, say, Markboard, which is another solution, digital solution I've used in the past, is Planboard now has the ability to link up with your Google Classroom. So you can, if you mark something on Google Classroom, which I absolutely love that platform for digital learning management, is Google Classroom. If I mark something on Google Classroom, I can then have it import straight into my gradebook in Adosio, which for me was just, when I saw that, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm in Adosio. I also learned that you can do pretty great rubrics. So you can make your own rubric in the app, and then you can quickly just mark it by tapping the different areas of the rubric that that student got. And that was a big game changer for me, because that's quick. I'm not highlighting anything. I haven't yet printed out those, but I know in the past, Adosio had the ability to actually print out the mark board per student. So they would print all the students' marks kind of on one page so that you could print them all out, do a run, kind of like your report cards, do a run for all your students and then send those home individually. So I haven't definitely gone through and given my final assessments for this last inquiry project, as I haven't kind of gone through them all, but definitely this is something that I'm going to pursue further, is using Google Classroom, as well as the digital management of using Google Classroom and then being able to import those marks as well as my class list into my mark board, which is in Adosio, all on my iPad, which I'm going to find probably pretty handy, because it's going to save me some time when I'm marking. It also allows me in Adosio to do a class list and then do a quick check of yes, they got it, or no, they don't got it, which is good for me to help capture my kind of observations and the conversations that I'm having with students. So that's essentially the things that I have kind of learned in my reflection. Did my students engage in inquiry? Yes, they did. Was it a complete and total independent inquiry where they were all on their own? No, it was definitely a scaffolded inquiry. It started out as being pretty teacher involved, because that's where they were, and I met them where their skills were and helped move them along. We were doing our structures and pulleys and gears unit. So as we moved towards them actually building their structures, they finally got to a point where they engaged in more independent type activities. And in that moment, when they started, and I think for me, kind of the light bulb was I walked into the classroom, because I do two different classes for science and social studies, and I walked into the other class and they had started without me. And they knew it was science. They got to work right away. They knew what they were working on. They knew why they were doing what they were doing, and the conversations I was having with them, they got it. And they didn't need me hand holding them to build their structures. And they all built different looking structures that did withhold a weight, and they could problem solve those and do all those great things. For me, I had many moments of frustration along the way where I questioned whether or not I was made the right choice in going back. Was I ready? Was I just, have I lost my mind in terms of what I wanted teaching and learning to look like when I was teaching? And then when that happened, where I had my students working and they were engaged, they were on fire, they didn't need me to handhold it, they got it, and they were doing what they needed to do, and they were there, and I got to work with different groups and problem solve Lego problems. That's when I knew, okay, yeah, I'm back. This is what I wanted this to look like. And it felt more like the familiar inquiry that I wanted it to be. And in that moment, I also realized that inquiry, it took a while to get set up, probably about 6 weeks to get to that point. But when we got to that point, I noticed my planning went down. My ability to get quality assessment data, if only I had recorded it better, my ability to get quality assessment data in terms of letting me know what my students knew was higher, because I could do it in the moment. I wasn't taking a ton of stuff home and marking it, because it was happening in the moment and I could capture that information as I was teaching. So I could assess in that moment. I wasn't doing a lot of planning. Students were doing most of the planning there right during class time. So I did notice planning went down, assessment went down, and my feelings of, say, job satisfaction, or my feeling as if I was doing the right thing, then I was feeling better about that. So far, so good. I'm glad we are where we are. We're moving on to our second science unit for this term, and I already have some really positive feelings towards how this is going to be going and where we are as a class. So perhaps when we're done that one, I will reflect on where we went from this one. So I also, while we're here, I wanted to mention a while back in January, I was contacted by an organization called Bully Brave, and they invited me to come on their podcast, and I did an interview with them talking about a lot of classroom management things and talking about bullying and how I approach that. Well, that podcast interview is airing tomorrow. They're releasing that podcast tomorrow. So I'd love if you would share the love that you give me if you would head on over and check out that interview. And I will be putting links on all of my social media to make sure that you have access to that and you know where to hop on over to go see it. They're such a great group of people, and it was a pleasure to work with them. And I was very honored to be invited to come onto their podcast. If you want to check me out on the Bully Brave podcast, then I will drop the link on my Facebook page, Instagram tomorrow, and you can check that out and see it. So I hope inquiry for you is going well, and I hope that you don't get discouraged or feel as though that you need to have what perfect inquiry looks like. That any attempt at using a bit more inquiry in your classroom is taking the right steps to move forward, and you're probably doing a much better job than you're giving yourself credit for. Don't be so hard on yourself. It will work out, and give yourself a break and you'll do wonderful. So I hope you have a good week and you have enjoyed your Easter and you're ready to go back to work tomorrow. So I will see you next week at 9 p.m. Eastern for another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Talk to you later. Bye.